So in the previous episodes, we've talked about the first principles and also like how to apply first principles. Now, these things that we're going to talk about today is more about different applications of getting to the truth of something. So I guess you can say it's like subtopics of first principles. So the first one I'll talk about is de-risking. And de-risking is something that is done in investment when people buy projects or something. They take out the capital. So then it's like the investments now are de-risked. But that's the investment perspective. But in terms of like application, you can think of de-risking as like the process of testing your assumptions. Because remember how we said having assumptions and operating assumptions is like ignorance. And so assumptions can present risk. And having one or more assumptions that are untrue especially can lead to conclusions that will become false. And that could be quite problematic in a lot of situations, especially like business circumstance. So like, for example, say you want to start like a business idea, or like say a startup business idea, and there's always a list of assumptions that it's built up on. So I'll go over like the top three that are very common. The first one is like, we have the assumption that our team can build a product. And then the second one is like, people will want your product. And the third is like, your product will generate profit. Now, these are very generic assumptions, right? When you're having a business startup idea, because everyone's very focused on the solutions, they also have like these assumptions that are built up on it, which I've just mentioned, but they're very generic. So you want to be able to break these down, and the more specific you are, the more you can understand whether or not this is actually feasible. So like, let's go over the first one. My team can build a product. So like, the way of applying or de-risking this is like, do you have like the right number of engineers, or like, do you have the right number of people to be able to create this product? Do your engineers and team have the right skills to build a product? And then to go even further with that is like, can you assess those skills? If it's not in your circle of competence, then who do you know who has that strength to be able to test that? And can you build this in a reasonable amount of time and within the reasonable budget? So like, that's like testing. So with this de-risking method, you're actually testing by asking questions and verifying whether or not this assumption is true based on like the startup idea you have. And I think this is what a lot of people if you watch Dragon's Den and Shark Tank, they do this type of thing. They really test your assumptions, because most people come out here and present like an idea to them, which they think is like going to be successful, but they really test you with reality. And then like the second one is like, people will want your product. So it's like, does your product solve the problem? Because we're always so quick, and maybe you might be able to agree on this. Like, we're always so quick to jump on the solution, right? That we even forget what the problem we're solving is. Like, I'm someone who's very, I'd say who's done that a few times, where I'm just like thinking about the tech already, where I'm like, wait, I have to step back and actually think about what problem are we solving. And then we have to, and you probably know from experience, like, you have to then understand what are the assumptions that are being made.
Really well said. Completely agree. I completely agree. I think it kind of makes sense why we just go straight into solution mode, because we're just trying to fix what that problem is and move on from it. But then, part of that solution is you can't get to the right solution if you don't know if you don't know the problem. So if you know the problem, you'll have the right solutions to address that problem. And you're right. I think that what I really liked you said was assumptions go into that solution. So instead of looking at the problem fundamentally as this is the problem, you start making assumptions of what that problem is, and then you build that solution based on assumptions rather than on the actual problem. The problem with that is that your solution is not in line with the problem. It's in line with assumptions. I've just said the same words like 6 times different times. But yeah, you can't, really well said, you can't base your solution on assumptions. It needs to be based on the problem. And part of that it goes back to the first principles. You sort of need to understand fundamentally what is your problem and what are you trying to solve. Yeah, no, really well said. Thank you.
No, and you have to be able to also like specify what that problem is, and also like, who is your target audience? Like, who are you targeting? Because if you make it generic and stuff, it's going to become very difficult for you to be even able to, in a way, connect with that audience as well. It's just like targeting niche and I think like part of that question of like your product is like, is it also simple to use, and is it like marketable, and does it have critical features of success, and what do you define as success for this product? So like these are the types of questions you can ask for like the success of your product to test the assumptions. And then the last one, which I mentioned, was like, your, will your product generate profit? And the way you test this is like, can you charge more for your product than it costs to make or market? Because a lot of people like to talk about revenue, and they hide it under revenue, right? They say like, oh, I made like $500,000 of revenue or something in like a year, but then it's like, oh, but the profit is like, I've only walked away with like 50,000. It's like there's a lot of expenses in that. In 90% is like expenses and stuff, and it's not really a good use of your resources in that sense, and like your energy, because you're giving your energy and stress. It's just like maybe you have to narrow down your focus because you're trying to focus so much that your expenses, everything's so high. Maybe you can do that eventually as you scale. So it's like, but you could have avoided all that if you just started actually questioning your assumptions from the beginning. So that's what I'm really trying to emphasize with de-risking. And that's what de-risking helps you do. Like it helps you prevent from getting from such a large scale problem where it's difficult to solve, or it's just like, if you had, as you said, like with the solutions, like had those assumptions identified and tested those from the beginning with questioning and like as you eventually progress and reflecting on those, then you would have avoided all of that, all of those issues. And I think the key here is like being, as you said, like more specific with your assumptions. Because the more specific you are, the more you're able to devise a plan to be able to de-risk them.
What do you mean by like? I think if we take a step back, what do you mean by assumptions? Is it like a hypothesis of the solution of that problem, or is it assuming conditions of that problem?
I would say like conditions of the problem as well.
Right.
Like I think I gave examples, like for example with this business startup idea, like most people already assume or think that they'll generate profit, like their product will. But you have to be able, like, you don't even know that yet. You don't even know what the costs and stuff that are involved in that yet. So it's like, I guess the best way to think about it is like conditions and just like biases probably that you automatically already think without even analyzing and identifying from the first principles perspective of what exactly it is.
So it's it's like what we said before. It's like the opinionated view rather than viewing it based on facts.
Exactly. Yeah. Really
Right.
well said. Really
Okay.
well summarized. That's the best way to see it.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah. Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
yeah. No, you're right. I think like just touching on that, like a lot of, again, I think when people start, if we look at a startup idea, for example, or businesses, if we look around what we see around us, we see very successful business owners, entrepreneurs that have made money, right? And so that's what we're going in with, is the assumption that because what we see is the end product, we see the achievement, we see the wins, we assume that, hey, if I do this, that's when it's going to correlate to automatically. But there's little steps in between that, we haven't thought of, or the person hasn't thought of. Maybe behind those wins, there were successive losses, there was successive, there's facts there that you don't know of. And so your whole basis on starting something is based on the winning mentality. Now, the winning mentality is a great mentality because, it motivates you to go and do it. But it's not great when adversity hits, because your winning mentality needs to be, the mentality needs to be different when adversity hits. Because all of a sudden it's like, oh, maybe I might not be able to make this. And it's like, cut my losses, at that point.
Yeah, I like how you really brought that up with like the winning mentality, because I didn't really think about it that way. But it's true. Like whenever we go with an idea, we're hyper optimistic.
Yep.
To the point that I don't think it's, would you say like it's bad then to delude yourself? Because in some ways, initially you do have to be somewhat delusional, like to be able to go out there and be like ambitious and to achieve it. But then I guess you should also fact check yourself along the process, that you're not going to be, as you said, like comparing yourself to someone's day 10,000th to your day one is not a realistic type of perspective. Like it's good to envision that in the future, but you can't expect that at the beginning with, and I think that's where this, as you said, the assumptions come from. It's just like unrealistic expectations initially, whereas it's such a gradual process.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. I also think like it's good to be delusional, but are you willing to be delusional when things go wrong? So when things are going really well, you know, you're delusional, you're very motivated, you're like, yep, top of it, it's going to go well. But as soon as the chips fall, are you someone that loses that delusional winning mentality of that highly optimistic view, or are you someone that just crumbles, right? And if you are someone that crumbles, that's okay, right? Because again, like people deal with adversity in different ways. It's not because you failed, you're stupid, right? Because if it's failed, have you walked away learning something from it? So if you've learned something from it, that's success in itself. It's like, okay, well, I tried. I was highly optimistic. I didn't consider adversity. It failed. Now I'm back to square one. Built my character. Now I can look at it from a different lens. But you're right. You've got to be a bit delusional. Like you've got to be optimistic in how you approach things. It's just that, are you willing to carry across consistently? And I think a lot of people do, like even the best of people would struggle with that, no doubt. So, you know, it's not to say that you have to be completely locked in, delusional 24/7. It's, are you resilient throughout those down times to really pick yourself back up and continue that momentum?
Yeah, I think that's really well said with like the adversity and like being delusional even in times when it's tough. And I think like with this de-risking thing as well, like the best way to actually see whether or not this is like, you know, where it's not probably the right approach, like because at some point you can keep persisting, but you don't see any results at all, then it's like a telltale sign that probably you have to completely change, like your product or whatever it is. So I think, or your approach. So I think the way you can identify that early is just like there's something called a critical, like identifying critical assumptions, like what will lead to success. So you have to really define what success is. And say, for example, with this startup idea we're talking about, the critical, I would say, assumption or like since something that you need to test is like whether or not the product actually solves the problem. Because if the product doesn't solve the problem, right, then you're not going to, all of the other assumptions will just not work, will not work as intended. And that means you have to completely change your approach then, or you have to change your product by, you know, as you identify what the problem is. So I think identifying what is the critical assumptions in whatever you're doing is very important. And this can apply to other things. Like it's not just startup idea. It can apply to like your policies or whatever you're going to introduce. You know, apply to vacation plans or like workout routines. It can apply to anything in your life, but you got to test what these assumptions are and identify what is the critical assumption where if this fails or if this is wrong, then everything else is like diminished. I think that's what's key.
So in that case, the critical assumption is sort of the fact rather than it being completely opinionated.
Yeah, I would say like the fact that will ultimately determine success.
Right. Okay. So then there's a fundamental truth to that sort of assumption that, yeah, okay, that makes sense.
So yeah, so that's like with de-risking. And then there's like other things as well with something called premature optimization. And I don't know if I'm pretty sure you would be able to agree on this, that sometimes we spend so much time before even testing our assumptions on perfecting our product or perfecting things. And I think Fizz said it as well, like he spends a lot of time perfecting everything, but that can also, but say you have like the wrong assumptions about things and you're trying to perfect a product or something, then that leads to a waste of time when you find out that the assumptions were wrong. And this happens a lot in like coding, especially in tech, where developers will spend a lot of time perfecting the code, like making the algorithm efficient, like tweaking it up and all that stuff. And but then the assumptions are wrong. So it's like all the time and money just sort of went out the window. So like, would you agree that we just spend too much time on perfecting?
Yeah, I think we do. I think we always try to look for the perfect answer. We always try to find the perfect way to do things. I think I've shared this before, but Jeff Bezos shared a quote I've heard on a interview, and he said, "If you want to succeed at something, you need to do it quick, do it fast, fail quick." Now that's not to say that you should just go out and just be absolutely irrational in what you do and completely screw things up for yourself. It's simply saying maybe instead of looking at the optimal way and the pre-operative optimization, there's a lot more learning from doing something quickly and potentially not going right. So that learning can then be applied to the next thing that you try. And it kind of makes sense because Amazon, if you look at it, started from a bookstore to now they do tech services and one of the biggest tech providers, etc. Right. So it's a completely different like pivot. But it tells you like the mentality was just try it. Fails, we've learned. Just do it again. So you're right. The perfection it really plays with you because when you don't find that perfect outcome, it really plays with you. So yeah, you're right. That premature optimization, I think everyone's guilty of it in some way, and it's sometimes you've just got to do the action. You know, like instead of writing up a whole workout plan, like I'll give myself an example. You know, I wrote up a plan like, oh, you know, I want to do this, train at this time thing. Yesterday, good example, like, you know, I had a full plan set out of how I want to approach my afternoon, had a really good workout routine, everything set. I'm like, yep. And then, you know, things sort of change in the afternoon, you know, with work. A lot of things came up last minute. So it was like, right, now I've got to just, instead of it letting it hinder me, it's like, okay, well, what can I do with the remaining time? And instead of just thinking about it, I just went to the gym and went for a run right after. So it was just like, sometimes you just got to do it. Instead of finding that perfect mindset, perfect time, perfect thing, because it's not going to happen.
Yeah, exactly. Agreed. And I'm also a victim to that as well. Like someone who does that a lot, or time to time, where it's just like having the perfect course, perfect like routine, perfect desk, perfect everything, and it's just like the amount of time you spend just wasting like these little perfection things, and the amount of output you're gonna get from it is not even worth the time. You're better off just starting and just doing the thing and just adapting in the situation. It's with so many. I think, yeah, it's something that everyone I think falls into the trap of perfectionism. And it's just like if you just, I think, just identified the critical assumptions of what led to success and just took the action immediately, you'd get a lot better of an output. And that reminds me of something called like Pareto principle, which is like you put 20% input and you get 80% output. And I think like that's maybe with your assumptions, if you can identify that with like which of it is like more priority that will lead to a better output, is probably the best way to start. Then you can immediately see results or get results that way. But obviously, you need to go through a process of like also reflecting consistently to make sure it's on the fact, like path of truth. So yeah, that's premature optimization. And now the next thing you might have probably heard is called MVP. It's very common in a lot of
Tech
companies
worlds.
you work for as
Tech
well.
world.
Yeah, especially tech world.
If you're a PO, product owner, product manager, tech, you'd know MVP. Let's get the most MVP out there.
Yeah, so
Is this the most MVP?
yeah. So it stands for minimum viable product, and it's basically a way to test your assumptions with something which has like the minimum amount of features that it needs to be able to be tested by real people. So the MVP can, I think, reduce premature optimization because it basically allows you to get actual feedback without working it all out yourself for too long. And usually it is the case, right? And maybe you can agree that your first plan, as you said yesterday, is going to always fail. Like the first plan will be a highly likely chance of failing. So instead of optimizing each little thing of that plan, it's just better off executing with whatever you have, which is MVP. Just have an MVP plan and just go with that. And then improve as you go. Like as you said, like would you agree that how many times have you faced where it's like you had a plan for everything and it failed? It didn't
Oh
go
yeah, yeah,
accordingly.
100%. Happens all the time. Happens all the time. It's human nature, right? It's the nature of what you do. Like, I mean, it depends what environment you work in, but you know what environment I work in, and based on my experiences, yeah, like, and I'm still trying to figure it out. It's like you can't have a plan for everything, every little thing. You've just got to be adaptable at times.
Yeah, definitely myself as well. Like, and I think because as we said, like with plans, there's assumptions, and there's even other assumptions you may not have thought of that came up, and then that just threw away the whole plan in a way. So I think, yeah, as you said, it's very important to be adaptive, and I think Mike Tyson would say as well, like everyone has a plan until they get punched in the mouth. And then that reminds me of another one, another quote, which was like on Twitter. I was just like, "Don't trust anyone that hasn't been punched in the face." So I think that's how you should see your plans, and the best way to really just be able to prevent yourself from going into this highly optimized state is just getting feedback as soon as possible. And the best way to get feedback is taking action. You can see it physical feedback, or you can get feedback from other people. And I think, like, have you heard of InView before? Do you remember like 10, 20 years ago, this 3D looking avatar thing, sort of like Sims, but not really Sims, but it's like more socially interacting? Well, so I'll just give an example of MVP, which was effective. So InView was like this online social entertainment platform where like, you remember, it rings a bell? It's so dodgy back in the way it looked.
Rings a bell. I just googled it. Yeah, it rings a bell for sure.
Yeah, and it's basically like an online platform, social entertainment platform where users are interact with each other via like 3D avatars. And the founder was Eric Ries, and he wrote actually a really good book called The Lean Startup. And this is actually now applied by like almost all big tech companies. Like this
Lean Six Sigma, or that is that where it's come from?
Sorry, was that?
Like Lean Six Sigma. I think it's one of the.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
that's where it's come from, has it?
I think it's come from there. Yeah, I think most of the lean approaches of tech companies have come from his book. And so he uses like lean startup principles to develop and grow like his business. And this was in 2004, by the way. So this is like 20 years ago. And I remember looking at this product, I'm like, what is this? Like, it looks so dodgy. But what he did was he was prioritized on receiving feedback as soon as possible instead of perfecting the product. And I think that actually gave him a big advantage because he realized that what he assumed that people wanted wasn't exactly what people wanted. So he had to make pivotal points. So instead of focusing initially, he was focused on integrating avatars with like existing messaging clients. He realized that people actually wanted a standalone platform where users can interact in these 3D environments. So you see how like with the MVP, he's able to immediately find out that his assumptions weren't exactly what people wanted and they weren't exactly correct. And he was able to then build a product of what people actually did want rather than imagine it's like spending a decade of building a product of things that people didn't even want in the beginning. It's like you almost wasted so much time. If you did that, if you tested feedback from the beginning or like the first 1-2 years, you would have saved 8 years of your lifespan and you would be able to build a product which will become a lot more used by people. And this approach of like these lean startup approach and this MVP is like what led to things like Dropbox, Airbnb, and like many other big tech companies and products.
Interesting. Yeah. See, I've always heard of MVP, and you sort of conceptually know what it's trying to do, but when you actually break it down really to the core of what it's trying to achieve, it actually makes sense. I mean, people with that would work in tech, etc. They would probably have a bit of background as to what that means. But yeah, I think just the background that I work in it, yeah, it's making me think I'm in my thinking phase stage right now. This conversation.
But it's not to say that it's not just in tech. It can be applicable, as I said,
Yeah,
across
exactly.
so many planes of
Yeah.
your life.
I think we're so like I think another perspective you just brought up is exactly that. I look at it from a very techie, that sort of perspective rather than applicable to life. Because when I use yesterday as yesterday as an example, like what was it that I really just what was the minute thing I wanted to achieve out of yesterday? It was just to get out and train. So whether it was 30 minutes, 2 hours, whatever it was. So that's what it sort of led to, was just go do it in some way. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just like with your plan, you can just have like instead of perfecting every little minute, it's just, you just have like a time zone, maybe like 30 minutes of exercise. That's it. It's a minimum viable product. Being consistent, that's it. So yeah, those are the things in regards to building on top of like first principles.
Nice. So that's all de-risking.
Yeah, well, it's de-risking. Then there's like the premature optimization, and there's also like the idea of MVP. So these three things are able to then test your assumptions as early as possible and prevent you from wasting time of trying to perfect something.
And these are all part of the mental models.
Yeah, I would say it's like methods and tools of thinking.
What I was thinking, yeah.
Because they do derive from like first principles, which is trying to verify our assumptions of many things,
right,
and prevent us from the path of ignorance. So you could say it's like a sort of subtopic of first principles, or like techniques and methods of first principles.
Cool.